Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to be able to get together this way for our warm-up to Topicals sessions. We always have something new going on with ATA, and we're so fortunate to have our speaker here this evening. I would just want to alert you that we have some programs coming up. On Saturday, February 19th, is what's new at ATA. We always have something new at ATA. It's just what we do, and we would love to have you come and hear about our new initiatives, which include our checklists, our show coming up, and what the fabulous project that Jennifer's been doing to establish our membership directory. So come and we'll have fun and we'll visit and we'll learn about what's new at ATA. And then on February 22nd, a Tuesday at 6 o'clock again, Felix Perez Fulch, who has a fan base because he manages to make Philately hilarious and fun. And he's going to do a program, two stamps, one journey. This is a program that he gave at the Great American Stamp Show. I didn't have an opportunity to see it, and maybe some of you also didn't. I promise you, you will laugh till you cry that evening. He's great fun. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Gregg Redner, who is Director of Music at Metropolitan United Church in London, Ontario, Canada. And he is also Assistant Professor of Music at the University of Western Ontario. He is a lifelong stamp collector, as he's been telling us about while we've been chatting here tonight, who focuses on the issues of Belgium, including the 1920 Olympics and Belgian railway stamps. Gregg, welcome. We're so excited to hear your program this evening.
Well, thanks very much. Let me just share my screen here. Thank you for either having a late dinner or an early dinner. It's a wonderful time to do a program, so I'm actually very excited to be here. I'm not the typical Olympic collector. A typical Olympic collector is a sports guy, you know, or woman who collects stamps because, you know, they're interested in sports and they discover, wow, there's lots of cool things that you can collect that are related to your sports interests. My Olympic collecting actually grew out of a kind of circuitous route that involved my grandfather, who fought in the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, and who was stationed in Belgium. And so I heard about the war from him. He gave me a few of his covers that he'd mailed home to my grandmother that I still have, and that I'm very fond of. And I decided when I was going to collect stamps that I would focus on Belgium. And a wonderful man in the Belgian Philatelic Studies Circle said to me, you know, you can't just collect Belgium. You have to decide on something and focus on it, or you're just going to wander. And I thought, well, why don't I collect the stamps that come after World War I? You know, it was connected to my grandfather and all of that. And within the years 1900 to 1920, I discovered that there was an Olympics in Antwerp, which I didn't know anything about. And from that grew this, you know, this what has been a 15-year project for me. So today we're going to talk in part about the stamp issues of the 1920 Antwerp Olympics. We're also going to talk a little bit about how this relates to topical philately and also thematic philately, which will grow out of it. This is a beautiful shot of the stadium at on the opening day. That's the American team walking around, and you'll see the stadium's considerably smaller than we are kind of used to today. Okay, so some historical background. The 1920 Olympic Games were the first ones to take place after World War I. The 1916 Olympics were supposed to take place in Berlin, but for obvious reasons they didn't, because of course the world was at war with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Olympics that took place before World War I were the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, and they didn't issue any stamps for that. But they did issue this beautiful vignette, or Cinderella, which is published, I think, in 16 or 17 different languages, which was used for advertising. With Stockholm, what you collect are the stadium cancels. But I just love that. It's a beautiful vignette. And of course, the 1912 Olympics are famous because those are the Olympics of Jim Thorpe, who won both the pentathlon and the decathlon in one Olympics by a considerable margin, and then sadly was stripped of his medals by the International Olympic Committee because he had at one time played minor league baseball. They were restored to him down the road in the 80s, I think. But the 1920 Olympic Games were supposed to take place in Budapest. Remember that, because later on we're going to see a beautiful Budapest Cinderella as well. But of course, Budapest was also part of the Hungarian Empire and an ally of Germany, and so they were not given the chance to host the Olympic Games. Now, you can imagine that a country that had been devastated to the extent that Belgium had, and that the German army was particularly brutal in Belgium. They were very angry with the Belgians because they wanted to attack France from the north, and they petitioned King Albert in 1914 to allow them to cross through Belgium to attack France. And he famously and heroically said, "I govern a nation and not a road. The answer is no." Well, a few weeks later, the Germans attacked through Liège, and that was the beginning of what was a very painful period, and some Belgian cities were completely flattened. This is a good example of the kind of situation, this picture, that a lot of the cities found themselves in. In total, 29 nations took part in the games, with a total of 2,600-ish athletes. In 22 sports, only 60 of the participants were women, and those were entirely in diving or in swimming. You can imagine at the end of an Olympics that happened at the end of a war, that the athletic performances were considerably lower than the remarkable athletic performances that had happened in Stockholm, because so many of the great athletes were wounded or were killed in the war. So it's not really known for its Olympic, for its athletic heroics. There was a lot of annoyance on the part of certain people that this was to be the Olympics of peace now that the war was over. Yet the Olympic Committee decided that they would exclude all the members of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the reasoning was probably pretty solid. They said they couldn't imagine a bunch of athletes sitting side by side with the people they had just been involved in a brutal war with. That it would not work. So they made the decision to exclude everyone that was on the Austro-Hungarian side. Interestingly, the decision was also made to hold the SPA conference on reparations, which was a conference that was designed to talk about disarmament, but also to talk about how the German government was going to pay Belgium and France back for the Tsar land and places that had been taken earlier. And the SPA conference takes place about 10 miles from Antwerp. This is a beautiful cover sent to the Commission on Reparations with our first view of the Belgian Antwerp Olympic advertising cancel. Some people think that the conference was held in Spa and the Austro-Hungarian allies were excluded from coming to the Olympics, and the Spa conference is a way to kind of rub salt in the wound. to hold it so close to the place where they were not allowed to be. There was a great deal of concern, obviously, about the Spanish flu. Like us, they were in the midst of a pandemic. There was quite a bit of influenza, and there's a not confirmed report that 7 athletes died of the Spanish flu during the Antwerp Olympics. Attendance by the public at these games was very light. I chose this card because you can imagine the games were given to the Belgian nation as a way of recognizing the suffering that the nation had gone through during the war. But they only had 16 to 18 months to go from the end of World War I and create an Olympic area that was not devastated and rebuilt. And so it cost a lot of money. It took a lot of pressure for the country to get it together. And most Belgian people who were not particularly well off were just looking for a way to make it from day to day. Jobs had not come back yet. Food was not consistent. There was a lot of poverty. And the cost of going to the Olympics was very expensive. So there was that. And then there also was the fact that there seemed to be amongst the Belgian Olympic Committee a feeling of the fact that to advertise the games through the press was not in keeping with the high values of sport. And so they basically excluded a lot of the press from anything to do with advertising the games. Interestingly, the only 2 events that were sold out were the bicycle races, because bicycle racing is huge in Belgium, and the final soccer game, which the Belgians played in. As we said, the late decision to hold the games in Antwerp meant that preparation was rushed and at times substandard. What they tried to do was use the foundations of buildings that had been destroyed during the war as a way to construct their Olympic venues. Here's a classic example of this. This is the foundation of the Citadel, which had been destroyed during an artillery bombardment when the city was occupied. And this is the moat that goes around the city walls, the Citadel walls. It's spring-fed, and it was cold as all get out. It's a natural spring-fed moat. Interestingly, as we'll see on the next slide, the Americans and the Australians complained bitterly about the temperature of the water. And during one of the polo matches, 2 Australian polo players had to be rescued from hypothermia during the match. Duke Kahanamoko, who you may or may not remember as the father of modern surfing, if you remember the old ABC Wide World of Sports, and I don't know if that's still on or not, once a year they would have the Duke Kahanamoko Surfing Classic from the Big Island in Hawaii. Well, Duke Kahanamoko was a great Olympic swimmer as well and won gold medals at a couple of Olympics. And he most famously said, the only thing faster than the American swimming team were the Belgian rats that regularly swam next to us in the moat. So not the ideal situation. There were other issues. Transportation was very difficult, especially for teams coming from North America. There hadn't been a return to large-scale luxury liners. Only about 40% were actually sailing. Famously, this ship is known as the Princess Matoika, which was taken from the Germans in the Philippines when the Americans entered the war, where it had been sequestered or whatever we would call it when it was put in a neutral port at the beginning of the war. This was a luxury liner that was used to transport sailors back and forth and soldiers back and forth to France and Belgium during the war, but it was also used to return the dead bodies of soldiers. And this ship transported, right after the transportation of the dead back to the U.S., almost 2/3 of the American Olympic team to Antwerp, and they were none too happy about it. And there was what is now famously called the mutiny on the Matoika, where the entire team threatened to not participate in the Olympic Games if their housing in Belgium was as awful as their quarters on this ship. Housing was a problem. A lot of buildings didn't have glass. Electricity hadn't been restored. Food was a problem. The American team regularly complained about the fact that they got one slice of bread and a sardine for breakfast, if they were lucky. There was influenza, and there's, of course, the problem of wide-scale rat infestation in a war zone. 3 Olympic symbols made their first appearance at the Antwerp Games. The first was the Olympic flag, which Pierre de Coubertin had designed with the 5 interlocking rings that we know so well now. This is a remarkable picture. This man actually raised the Olympic flag at the Antwerp Olympics when he was a young man, like I don't know how old, but maybe early teens. He was the flag boy. And when the Olympics, and this is the flag that was raised, when the Olympics were over, he simply took the flag down, nobody wanted it, and he put it in his closet. And 60 years or 70 years later, he discovered it, and it was auctioned off for well over $100,000. He looks very happy about that. The second Olympic tradition was the administering of the Olympic oath, which had never taken place before. And the third was the awarding of medals at the level of gold, silver, and bronze. There had been award medals given at gold and sometimes silver, but never at 3 different levels before. This is not my gold medal, sadly. I own a participation medal, which was dear enough, but a gold medal from Antwerp goes for about $4,000, and I'm not going to spend that. But it's a beautiful, beautiful piece. Of course, you can't talk about sports in Canada without talking about hockey. Interestingly, at the Summer Olympics, there were 2 demonstration sports. They took place in April. The first Olympic hockey tournament took place, and also figure skating took place with pairs figure skating, which had taken place, I think, in Stockholm, but not all 3, men's, women's, and pairs. This is a very interesting team. They were largely Icelandic immigrants who had moved to Winnipeg. They're a semi-professional team known as the Winnipeg Falcons. And in their Olympic tournament, only 1 goal was scored on them. And they were clearly as is always the case with Canadian teams, they were clearly the toast of the town. 2 other famous Olympians, the Flying Finns, Hans Kolmonen, and of course Paavo Nurmi, his much more famous partner. Paavo Nurmi was the first Olympic athlete that was thought to have practiced in a scientific manner. He was a real technician, and he went on to win gold medals, I think, at 3 different Olympics. And Hans Kolmonen was his equal, but not quite as famous. Beautiful stamps from Finland. So the postal issues for the 1920 Games. This is not the first Olympics to feature stamp issues. That honor goes to the 1896 first modern games in Athens. This is one of those stamps. Remember this discus thrower. He will play a significant part in the rest of our story. So this is one of the Olympic stamps from 1896. But the Belgian government really liked the idea of issuing stamps. They thought it would be a good way to get the word out on the games. The idea originally came from Gaston Stalland, who was a well-known designer and the chairman of a charity that was designed to aid athletes who had been injured, or soldiers who had been injured during the war. And so he proposed the idea that they issue stamps with a surcharge, the money to go towards the charity. The idea was not embraced enthusiastically. Um, the idea of using classical sort of um, stamp composition. People were a little bit afraid of the fact that the stamps that had been proposed looked too much like the stamps that had been used in Greece. This is another one of the Greek stamps. Remember this, however, because this is going to look very similar to one of the stamps that was eventually released. There were many issues in creating the Olympic issue once it was approved. There was, of course, damage to the infrastructure. The printing house, government printing house in Malin or Mechelen, had been used by the Germans as a store depot and a warehouse. There was concern about the time frame. They basically had less than a year to produce and release the stamps. And there was the cost as well. The premier designers of Belgian stamps at the time were involved in the issue of these stamps, of which there are 10 that are released, all with this image. It's a famous image of King Albert, known as the Tin Hat issue. And this is from a famous photograph that had been taken while he was in exile. And the government was in exile. And so this was the real focus of the government because it was the victory issue. A final decision after a competition was made to, strangely, have the American Banknote Company in New York produce the stamps. There had been two other printers who had been considered. One was Enschede in Haarlem, Holland, and the other was Waterloo in the UK. But the Enschede folks were involved in the production of the stamps we had just seen and didn't think they could turn around anything. So their offer to the Belgian government was not particularly attractive. After seeing the proofs, the Minister Rankin, who was the postal minister, thought for certain that these stamps would be a tremendous success with the Belgian public. They would be very proud of them. And he made what was one of the great gaffes in early Belgian philatelic history. The American Banknote Company said, if you're going to buy 5 million of each of the three stamps, why don't you buy 10 million of each? And if you do, we'll give you a 10% discount. And so they did. And as we'll find out in a little bit, that was not the wisest decision. They were still selling the stamps 11 years later. So here they are. These are the three issues that were made. You can see the discus thrower. You can see that this looks remarkably like the Greek stamp we saw earlier. They were issued at 5 centimes, 10 centimes, and 15 centimes. And if you look at the bottom, there's a 5-cent surcharge for the wounded, for those who had been wounded in the war. This was a great idea in principle, but 5 cents extra was a lot of money for the average citizen in a nation that was recovering from a devastating war. And so the stamps were not sold to any great extent. It was originally thought that when the American Banknote Company archives were dispersed and sold, a lot of them ending up at the Smithsonian, not a lot of material came out of the sale. And so it's generally been considered that there's almost no pre-production stamp material for this issue. But a couple of things have surfaced from a wonderful collector in Northern Europe named Lawrence Jonker and Manfred Bergman. Here is a maquette, which is actually an original piece of art that pre-existed with the area around it painted. And if you look at this, you can see that they basically changed the arm, changed the knee, and changed the hair. And that's what they ended up with on the essay and the eventual stamp. This is a very rare dye-proof essay. Now, this is a remarkable thing. These are photo dye proofs. And no one knew that these existed. And about 8 years ago, and unfortunately, I didn't know it at the time, these appeared as photo pictures of Olympic stamps on eBay. And they were listed, I think, at $100 to start. They eventually sold for $600. Now I can't imagine what they would go for. It was a real steal. But these contain all of the information about the changes that were made eventually on the issued stamps. And they're just spectacular. Back during the summer, I was on doing my usual thing, which I'm sure we all do, which is looking at my Del Camp saved searches at night before I went to bed. And these two die proofs, color die proofs, popped up under the Olympic stamps as stamps printed on card. And no one actually knew that there were any die proofs that existed on cardstock. And I got them for a real steal, and I felt very lucky to get them and actually kind of guilty. But there, as far as we know, there are only 2 sets of these that exist. There are none for the 10-cent stamp that anyone is aware of. So the design for the 5-cent stamp comes from Myron's Discobulus, which is the most famous copy is in the Vatican Museum. It's a bronze statue, and I think you'll see that they followed this very, very closely in the engraving. It's actually a remarkable likeness of the body. The head is turned incorrectly for this, but it's a lovely piece. The 10-cent design is said to be taken from the horses that used to grace the facade of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. They're really, this is I think, probably pretty accurate with that as well. What I also find interesting, let me just go back really quickly here. Oh, sorry, you don't want to see that. Let me just go back. What I think is interesting too is there's a wide variety of extra decorative material on this. So I think it's very interesting that they also, the columns are even different, which is quite interesting. There are also sets of imperfs. 300 were distributed by the Belgian government to famous people and to politicians. But there were 150 that were found in the American banknote archives and were distributed as well. There's only, as far as we know, last I've heard, 2 existing imperf blocks of 4, and those are the 15 centimes. I don't have any of those. They're just very special. So the advertising cancellations, which are really what we're excited about in this issue. The advertising cancellations were issued for the 5 largest cities in Belgium. So Ghent, Antwerp, Brussels, Liège, and Charleroi. And each city got at least one. Brussels and Antwerp got more, and Ghent also had extras. There was one issued for Charleroi and one issued for Liège. This chart has a lot of material. We won't go into it in any great detail, but you'll see over here on the right side, there's a rarity index. The lower the number, the less rare the individual cancellation is. So the more common ones are in Antwerp and Brussels. There are 2 in Brussels. You get into slightly less common ones when you get into Charleroi and also the Ghent 3 post office. But the absolute granddaddy of all Belgian Antwerp Olympic cancels is the one that comes from the Ghent 1 post office. As far as we know, and it's my recent counting that said that there were probably 15 to 17 of these that exist. There's always been a lot of discussion about why a couple of these are more rare than other ones. And because if you think about it, I mean, there's very little reason that this one should be 20 times more uncommon than, say, the Brussels North cancel. For a long time, people thought it was because there were no major Olympic events held in Charleroi and in Ghent. I think Ghent had a soccer qualifying match, and Charleroi didn't have anything. But I did some research in the archives, and I came up with, I think, an answer to why this is the case. So the interesting part about Belgium is it's divided in half linguistically. The north speaks Flemish, the south speaks French. There's one officially bilingual area, which is the area in Brussels, which is, of course, the capital. There are also a few German-speaking regions that have gone back and forth between Belgium and Germany over the course of several world wars, but it's a minor language. If you look here, you'll notice that in Brussels, there are two languages represented in the cancel. The top is French, the bottom is Flemish. But if you look at the one that was issued in Ghent, in the Flemish-speaking area, the top language is Flemish and the bottom is French. So depending on the region that the cancels were issued in, you either had French on the top, if it was French-speaking, or Flemish on the top. So why are some of them more common than others? It turns out that Ghent 1 and Antwerp 1 and Brussels 1 and Liège 1 are all the administrative post offices for their cities. If you look down here, this is the very famous, if you've ever been to Ghent or seen pictures of that remarkable canal with those spectacular houses right along it, the Flemish houses from the 16th century, this is where this is. The Ghent 1 post office, the administrative post office, was in an area that originally had started as kind of the center of marketing and distribution. The Ghent 3 post office was at the railroad station. So when these were issued, it turns out that a lot more mail went through the Ghent 3 post office than went through the Ghent 1 post office. Something like 40% less mail went through Ghent 1 than went through Ghent 3. And that, I think, explains why. And that's the case in Antwerp and Brussels and Liège as well. Okay, so the advertising cancels. This is the granddaddy of all, as we say, Ghent 1. There also was a circular date stamp, which is unbelievably rare, that was issued at the Olympic Stadium. And it's a beautiful circular date stamp. There are not a lot of them that exist, maybe 15. This is a very special one because even though I think it obviously is a philatelic cancel, it's very rare to find these cancels on the Olympic stamps themselves. And these are all socked on the nose. They're just beautiful. So only 15 of those exist, in part because the actual office was only open for a little over a month. Now, vignettes and postcards. This is the Olympic poster, which was later turned into a postcard. Again, they didn't do a very good job of advertising with the poster. The poster is probably the smallest Olympic advertising poster I've ever seen, and would easily have been overwhelmed on a board with a lot of other things. But it's a beautiful Art Deco style poster. Now, that poster was used as the mock-up for what was the vignette offered for sale by the Belgian Olympic team or committee. These are beautiful. They come in 5 different colors, as we're going to see. Very rare to find them used with Olympic stamps, but even more rare to find them with the actual circular date stamp. We don't know who produced these. We don't know how many they produced. We don't know who the engraver was. There's very little known about them, but they're quite beautiful. They were offered in 5 different colors. The rarest of the bunch is this rust-colored one. If you think to yourself, geez, these look kind of rough, these are actually beautiful copies of the Olympic vignettes. Most of the ones you find, the perforations look like they've been cut with a bread knife. They're just really terrible, and they're made on a very rough paper, so they catch dirt, and most of them are kind of a bit grubby. These are quite lovely. The Swiss wanted to issue a stamp to raise money for their Olympic team. But there's a Swiss law that says you cannot use the postal system to advertise any event which is not taking place inside the confines of Switzerland. So they were not able to issue a stamp. Instead, they issued these vignettes. There was a competition held. 2 of the vignettes exist. This is the one that won. This is on a postcard which was also produced to raise money, contemporary for the time. But this is the second issue that was entered. There probably were others, but this is the second one that exists. And I particularly like this one. You can see they were very clear about what they wanted. If you look down here, they're very consistent with what it is. But I love this one because the spear thrower looks kind of like Beavis from Beavis and Butthead. It's a very rugged, very kind of primitive looking stamp. These are very hard to find used philatelically. And if you can find it on the back of an actual postcard from the time, the vignette, it's very valuable. So this is the last vignette that was issued for the Olympics. People tend to think this had to do with the Antwerp Olympics, but this was actually issued in Budapest, and it has to do with the 1920 bid for the Olympics. You can see all of the nations around the outside. The bit on the bottom says, "Make this a Hungarian Olympics," and this was for the Olympic bid prior to World War II, or World War I. Last of all, there are some spectacular Art Deco cards produced by the Verelst company. There are 10 of them. They're all exceedingly beautiful. They're very rare. If you ever have the chance to get one, whether it's used or not, pick it up, because a complete set of these is just outside my mind with the value of them. They're very rare. And very beautiful. I love the colors on them. Well, so this is about thematic collecting and topical collecting. We're at the ATA after all. So what do you do after you've collected the 3 stamps and the various cancels, and you found them on interesting usages? Well, you start to look around and see what is out there that is available in a thematic and a topical sense. And what I discovered was there was a remarkable collection of stamps that honored the 1920 Olympics. This one is particularly lovely because it is on a contemporary card from that actual 1920 Olympics with this stamp on it honoring the anniversary of the Olympics, a beautiful image of Baron Pierre de Coubertin, and of course the Olympic poster. Then, of course, the Belgian stamp issuing office was very proud of their history as being an Olympic country, and they have issued this stamp, this card with this special stamp on it, a number of times to celebrate Belgium's continuing participation at various Olympics. And this, of course, is for the Mexico City Olympics in 1968. There is a mistake on this. This was the 7th Olympics and not the 8th. So it's very interesting that that got by this first day cover. And of course, here it is in a black form, offered for the Montreal Olympics in 1976. Very close to home here. Of course, you can find these stamps in some beautiful and strange issues. Here's a set from the Dominican Republic, an imperf set from the Dominican Republic, which is very beautiful. Here's a cover that was issued in Estonia. It was at the 1920 Olympics that Estonia won its first Olympic medal, the silver medal with the weightlifter Alfred Newland, who is honored here. They also issued a very rare silver commemorative, which I have not been able to get a hold of. Brazil issued some stamps to honor two marksmen who featured in the 1920 Olympics. And then I thought to myself, well, there has to be some other things that relate beyond just commemorations. And I started to look around, and I discovered that this stamp, which is part of honoring the history of the International Olympic Committee, features the head of the Belgian Olympic Committee, and he eventually became the head of the International Olympic Committee, Latour, Ballet Latour. This is a very interesting issue that is from North Korea and is actually quite rare, partly because of the embargo in the U.S., but also just because you don't find many Olympic stamps coming to North America from North Korea. And it's a lovely set. Then there are also postcards. This is a contemporary postcard of Ludovika and Walter Jakobsen, who were the gold medal pairs skating champions. She was the first female Finnish Olympian. Wow, that's misspelled. Sorry about that. I'll have to fix that. And they were the silver medalists in 1924 at Chamonix, France. And I found this really interesting. In Mexico City, there were various tobacco products that were issued commemorating the Olympic Games that had happened up until 1948. And here's a Mexican cigar band for the old Antwerp cigar brand, which was contemporary with the '68 Olympics. Then on top of this, I got fascinated with the Discobulus. We're almost done now. I got fascinated with the Discobulus and started to look around and discovered that there were 210 stamps which had been issued with Myron's Discobulus on them. Here are a few, of course, the original issue from Athens, this beautiful stamp from Belgium for the '72 Munich Olympics. This lovely commemorative from Barbados mini sheet. This set from Ireland is actually quite rare. There were not a lot of them made, and a good number of them were destroyed. And of course, Greece and the 100-year anniversary in 1996 of the 1896 Games. And Colombia. And last of all, for the stamps, the Republic of Upper Volta, which is very interesting to me, in 1963, which was not an Olympic year, very interesting. And this very rare vignette from the 1956 Australian Games, which is quite rare. Of course, they had to use the Discobulus on fancy cancels as well. I love this one from Cremona, which was not used for the Olympics, but for a local sporting competition. The Italians issued this beautiful card. And last of all, my favorite of all, 1949 from Japan. If you look down here, Myron's Discobulus appears in this beautiful cancel on this 1949 card. Okay, last of all, if you're interested in the subject, I just want to draw your attention to the Sports Philatelist International Organization, which is an ATA affiliate. It's been in existence since 1962. They have a remarkable journal, which has some incredible research in it. If you want to know about anything to do with sports stamps, you can find it there. and you can find them at sportstamps.org. So that concludes the presentation. Thanks so much. I hope you're still awake.
Well, Gregg, thank you ever so much. I think you embody topical and thematic. Great enthusiasm, and that was wonderful. Thank you very much.